The sun used to hit the breakfast table at exactly 7:15 in the morning. I remember the way the light reflected off the silver spoons, the ones I had polished every Sunday for 40 years. My home was not just a building of brick and mortar. It was a sanctuary built with the calluses on my hands and the quiet prayers I whispered over my children's beds while they slept. I am Clara, and for a long time, I believed I was the heartbeat of a family that could never break. We had everything. Not the kind of everything you see in magazines, but the kind that matters. I remember the smell of fresh pine during the winters and the way the floorboards creaked in a specific rhythm when my son, Gabriel, would sneak into the kitchen for a late-night glass of milk. My daughter, Elena, was the light of my eyes. She had my mother's laugh a sound that could make even the hardest day feel like a victory. When my husband passed away 15 years ago, I promised myself that I would be both the pillar and the roof. I poured every cent of the inheritance, every bit of my energy, and every ounce of my soul into ensuring they had a legacy. I wanted them to be safe. I wanted them to be powerful. The house was always full of life. I kept the garden pristine because Gabriel loved the white lilies, and I kept the pantry stocked with the specific tea Elena liked when she had a deadline at work. I was the silent engine. I didn't mind the sacrifices. I didn't mind that I stopped buying clothes for myself so they could have the best educations. I didn't mind that my back ached from years of maintaining that massive estate alone. In my mind, the house was a promise. As long as this house stands, we are together. I remember the Sunday dinners. They were sacred. I would spend all day in the kitchen, the steam from the pots fogging up my glasses, making the recipes my grandmother passed down. We would sit for hours, talking about their careers, their dreams, their futures. Gabriel was becoming a successful architect, and Elena was rising in the corporate world. I felt such a profound sense of pride. I thought I did it. I guided them to the shore. I never suspected that the shore I was guiding them toward was one where I would be left behind. Money was never a topic of conversation that felt dirty back then. It was just a tool. I had managed the family accounts with a meticulous hand. The investments my husband left were substantial, but I had grown them. I lived frugally so the capital would stay untouched, a safety net for my children's children. I would show them the ledgers sometimes, teaching them about responsibility. I saw the way their eyes tracked the numbers. At the time, I thought it was admiration for my stewardship. I realize it was a different kind of hunger. Everything felt so solid. The walls of my home felt impenetrable. I remember sitting on the porch as the sun set, watching Gabriel and Elena laugh near the old oak tree. I felt a deep, warm peace. I had given them everything. My youth, my health, my resources. I believed that love was a bank account where you only deposited, and eventually the interest would be the comfort of your old age. I didn't know that my children were already calculating the cost of my presence. I didn't know that the very walls I had painted and cared for were being measured for a sale I never authorized. To me, it was the perfect life. To them, it was just an asset waiting to be liquidated. It started with the phone calls. Or rather, the lack of them. For decades, my phone was an extension of my hand, a constant link to their lives. Gabriel would call me just to describe a building he had seen, and Elena would vent about her colleagues while I stirred the soup. But slowly, the calls became shorter, more transactional. How are you, Mom? Good. Did you get that document I sent? Okay, talk later. The warmth was being replaced by a professional efficiency that chilled my bones. I told myself they were busy. Success, after all, requires a certain amount of coldness toward the world. I just never thought that coldness would extend to me. I remember the first time Gabriel mentioned the efficiency of the house. We were sitting in the living room, and he wasn't looking at the photos of his childhood on the mantel. He was looking at the ceiling, calculating the cost of heating such a large space. "It's a lot of work for you, Mom," he said, his voice smooth like silk, but with an edge I didn't recognize. "Maybe it's time to simplify." Simplify. It's a beautiful word, used to describe the act of stripping someone's life of everything they love. He started talking about property taxes and maintenance fees, as if the memories we made in those halls had a price tag. I laughed it off, thinking he was just being practical. I didn't see the blueprint he was already drawing in his mind. Then came the visits that felt like inspections. Elena would come over, but she no longer sat in the kitchen to help me peel potatoes. She would walk through the rooms with her phone in her hand, taking notes, whispering into her headset about market value and curb appeal. When I asked her what she was doing, she would give me a tight, practiced smile. "Just thinking about the future, Mom. We have to be prepared." Prepared for what? I was 72, healthy, and independent. Or so I thought. I started noticing things missing, small items, a silver vase here, an old clock there. When I asked about them, they told me I was just misplacing things. "Your memory isn't what it used to be, Mom," they would say in unison. It was the first time they planted the seed of doubt in my own mind. The dinners became silent affairs. The laughter that used to fill the dining room was replaced by the sound of silverware scraping against china. Gabriel and Elena would exchange looks over my head long, meaningful glances that I wasn't supposed to understand. It's a specific kind of pain to be a stranger in your own home, surrounded by the people you birthed. I felt like a ghost haunting my own hallways. They began talking about me in the third person while I was sitting right there. "She's getting slower," Elena would whisper. "She forgot to turn off the stove yesterday," Gabriel would reply. I hadn't forgotten the stove. I had just left it on to boil water for their tea. But when I tried to defend myself, they looked at me with a pity that felt like a slap. I remember one afternoon when I found them in my study, going through the old metal filing cabinet where I kept the deeds and the bank statements. They didn't even look guilty when I walked in. Gabriel just closed the drawer and told me they were organizing my affairs to make things easier for me. He spoke to me like I was a child, using slow, exaggerated movements. He took my hand, the hand that had wiped his tears, and bandaged his knees and told me that I deserved a rest. A long, permanent rest from all responsibilities. I felt a shiver down my spine, a primal instinct warning me that the walls were closing in. The garden began to wither. Not because I stopped caring for it, but because Gabriel hired a service to take over. They ripped out the lilies I loved and replaced them with low-maintenance shrubbery that had no scent and no soul. It's more manageable this way, he explained. Every change was presented as a gift to me, a way to lighten my load. But with every gift, I felt a piece of my identity being chipped away. I was being erased from my own life, one lily at a time. I started staying in my room more, afraid of what else they would simplify if I wasn't looking. I was still the owner of the house on paper, but I was becoming a prisoner in reality. The final sign was the lawyer, a man I didn't know, sitting at my dining table with a stack of papers that smelled like ink and betrayal. My children stood behind him like shadows. They told me it was just a power of attorney, a simple formality to ensure they could help me if I ever got sick. They didn't mention that they were already looking at brochures for places with 24-hour care. They didn't mention that my bank accounts were already being linked to theirs. I signed. I signed because I love them. I signed because I couldn't believe that the flesh of my flesh would ever want to see me disappear. I thought I was signing for protection. I didn't know I was signing my own eviction notice from the world of the living. The silence in the house began to have a different weight. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a resting home. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a waiting room. I started to notice how they looked at my belongings, not as objects of sentimental value, but as inventory. One Tuesday, Elena spent the entire afternoon in the attic. I could hear her footsteps echoing above my head, sharp, decisive thuds that sounded like a countdown. When she came down, her silk blouse was covered in dust, and she held a small wooden box that contained my wedding veil and the dried rose from my first anniversary. "We should clear this out, Mom," she said, not looking me in the eye. "It's a fire hazard. All this old paper, all these old fabrics, they don't serve a purpose anymore." It wasn't just the objects, it was the way they began to edit my history. Every time I tried to tell a story about their father, or about the struggles we faced to build that estate, Gabriel would cut me off. "We know the stories, Mom. You've told us 1,000 times." His voice was never loud, but it had a clinical coldness that made my heart shrink. He started bringing home brochures for luxury living communities. He would leave them on the coffee table, the glossy images of smiling seniors, playing bridge staring back at me like a threat. When I pushed them aside, he would just sigh, a long, performative sigh of someone dealing with a difficult subordinate. The most painful part was the kitchen. The kitchen was my throne, the place where I nourished them. But slowly, they began to invade it. Elena brought in a nutritionist, a young woman with a clipboard, who looked at my spice cabinet as if it were a crime scene. "Too much salt, too much fat," she concluded. Suddenly, the meals I loved were replaced by bland, pre-packaged containers that Gabriel brought over. "It's for your health, Mom," he'd say. I would sit at the head of the table, staring at a plastic tray of steamed vegetables, while they sat across from me, whispering about the viability of the south wing of the house. I wasn't a mother anymore. I was a project they were trying to finish. I remember a specific night when the rain was lashing against the windows, and I felt a deep sense of dread. I went to the hallway to check the locks, and I saw them in the study. The door was cracked open. They had the large map of the property spread out on the desk, the land my husband and I had spent decades paying off. Gabriel was pointing at the old barn and the orchard. "If we subdivide this," he whispered, his voice thick with a greed he couldn't hide, "the development value triples. But we can't do anything while she's still here. The liability is too high." Elena nodded, her face illuminated by the desk lamp, looking like a stranger. "The doctor said the cognitive assessment will be ready by Thursday. Once we have that, the rest is just paperwork." My breath caught in my throat. Cognitive assessment? They had told me the doctor's visit was just for a routine checkup. I retreated to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the photos on my nightstand, Gabriel in his graduation gown, Elena in her first ballet recital. I searched those frozen faces for the children I knew, the ones who used to run to me with scraped knees. Where did they go? When did the love turn into a calculation? I realized then that they weren't waiting for me to get old. They were actively pushing me into a version of old age that suited their bank accounts. Every concern they voiced was a break in the wall they were building around me. I felt the cold realization that my presence was no longer a blessing to them. It was an obstacle. I was the lock on a vault they were desperate to open. I spent the following weeks performing a delicate dance of self-deception. Every time I heard them whispering in the hallways, I would turn up the radio and hum a tune from my childhood, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, these were my children. I had carried them in my womb. I had stayed awake through their fevers and celebrated every small victory of their lives. A mother's heart is designed to forgive before a sin is even committed, and I used that capacity to build a fortress of denial around me. I told myself that Gabriel was just stressed by the economy and that Elena's coldness was a symptom of her high-pressure job. I looked at the brochures for the care homes they left scattered around and moved them to the recycling bin with a trembling hand, whispering to the empty air, they would never. Not to me. My faith in them became my only anchor. Overcompensate, trying to prove my usefulness so they wouldn't have a reason to doubt my mind or my place in the house. I woke up at 5 in the morning to scrub floors that were already clean. I cooked elaborate 3-course meals, even though they barely touched the food, hoping that the familiar smells of home would wake up the children they used to be. I was exhausted, my joints aching with every movement, but I wore a mask of perfect vitality. I sacrificed my own comfort to show them I wasn't a burden. I stopped mentioning my headaches or the way the stairs felt steeper every day. If I showed no weakness, they would have no weapon to use against me. Or so I prayed. I remember one Sunday morning, I sat in the front pew of our parish church. I prayed with a fervor I hadn't felt in years. I asked for their hearts to soften, for the greed to wash away like dust in the rain. I wanted to believe that this was just a phase, a temporary lapse in their character. When I came home, I found Gabriel in my bedroom, looking through my jewelry box. He held my mother's pearl necklace, the one I had promised to Elena for her wedding day. He didn't look startled. He just looked at me with a tired expression. "We need to get these appraised for insurance, Mom," he said. Instead of screaming, instead of asking why he was touching my private things, I just nodded. I said, "That's very responsible of you, Gabriel." The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but the Nagaka the denial was easier than the truth. I began to give them everything they hadn't even asked for yet. I told them I wanted to simplify the accounts. I told them that if they needed a little extra for their projects, the money was there. I thought that by feeding the wolf, I could tame it. I sacrificed my financial security, signing documents without reading them, handing over the keys to accounts I had guarded for decades. I was buying their love, or at least, I was buying the illusion of it. Every time Elena gave me a brief, cold hug after I signed a transfer, I clung to it as if it were a life raft. I was drowning, and I was grateful for the hand that was pushing my head under the water, as long as it was a hand I recognized. The denial reached its peak during my 73rd birthday dinner. It was just the three of us. The table was set with the fine linens, and the candles were flickering, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. They were so kind that night. Gabriel toasted to my health, and Elena talked about how much she learned from my strength. For a few hours, I allowed myself to believe the nightmare was over. I pushed the memory of the cognitive assessment and the property subdivision into the darkest corner of my mind. I laughed. I drank the wine. I looked at them and saw my babies again. I chose to be blind. I chose to believe that the predator at my door was just a stray cat looking for warmth. I didn't realize that the dinner was a farewell, a final meal before the execution. Even when I noticed the moving boxes tucked away in the garage, I told myself they were for Elena's office renovation. Even when my favorite armchair was loaded into a truck while I was napping, I told myself it was being sent for reupholstering. I was a master of excuses. I was a martyr for a cause that had already been lost. I believed that my sacrifice of my dignity, my agency, and my truth would be enough to save the family. I didn't understand that to them, my sacrifice wasn't a gift, it was a surrender. They didn't want my love, they wanted my absence. And I was giving them everything they needed to make it happen, all while praying for a miracle that would never come. The morning of the betrayal was deceptively ordinary. It was a Tuesday, a day that felt thin and gray, as if the world itself were losing color. I woke up thinking it was a day for laundry and gardening, but the air in the house was heavy with an unspoken finality. Gabriel and Elena were already in the kitchen, dressed in suits, as if they were going to a funeral. There was no coffee brewing. There was only a silence so sharp it felt like it could cut through my skin. I remember the way Gabriel held the silver pan, clicking it repeatedly, the sound echoing like a ticking bomb. "Mom, sit down," Elena said. Her voice didn't have the warmth of a daughter. It had the clinical detachment of a judge. They didn't look at me. They looked at the documents on the table, the same papers I had signed with blind faith, thinking I was protecting our future. They explained, in terms that were too cold for a family kitchen, that the house had been sold. Not just the land, not just the orchard, but the very walls that held my memories. "It's already done, Mom. The closing was yesterday. You don't have to worry about the maintenance anymore." I felt a sudden coldness spread from my chest to my fingertips. I tried to speak, but my throat was a dessert. I wanted to ask where I would live, but the answer was already parked in the driveway, a black car with a driver I didn't recognize. The shock didn't hit me all at once. It came in waves of agonizing clarity. They told me they had found a wonderful place, a facility that specialized in memory support. The words were euphemisms for a prison with white walls and sterilized air. When I protested, Gabriel pulled out the cognitive assessment they had secretly obtained. He pointed to a signature mine on a document I barely remembered signing during my birthday bliss. They used my love and my trust as the evidence of my decline. "You're not safe here alone, Mom. You're forgetting things. You're a liability." To hear the children I had raised call me a liability was a pain more profound than death. It was the total erasure of my personhood. Then came the physical betrayal. They had already packed my life into 6 cardboard boxes. Everything else, the piano, the heirlooms, the memories of 40 years, was marked with colored stickers for an estate auction. I watched from the window as movers began to carry out my husband's desk. I saw my wedding dress stuffed into a trash bag because it was too old to keep. I turned to Elena, begging her with my eyes, but she just checked her watch. "We're on a schedule, Mom. The facility expects us by noon." There was no hug. There was no "I'm sorry." There was only the brutal efficiency of 2 people who had successfully liquidated a nuisance. They drove me to the outskirts of the city, to a building that looked like a hospital disguised as a hotel. The sign out front read Golden Sunset Sanctuary, but to me, it looked like a tomb. As we walked through the automatic glass doors, the smell of industrial lavender and bleach hit me, making my stomach churn. Gabriel spoke to the receptionist with a smile that never reached his eyes, handing over my medical records as if he were dropping off a car for repairs. "She gets confused easily," he whispered, loud enough for me to hear. "She might resist at first, but she'll settle in." I wasn't a mother to them anymore. I was a transaction that had finally been completed. The most violent moment of the shock was when they led me to my room 302. It was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. My 6 boxes were sitting in the corner, looking pathetic and small. Elena looked around and adjusted a vase on the nightstand. "It's cozy, right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly for the first time. Second, I saw a flicker of the little girl I used to tuck in at night, but she quickly masked it with her corporate armor. She checked her phone. A notification popped up, a bank alert. I saw the numbers on her screen from the corner of my eye. It was the deposit from the sale of my home. The price of my soul split 2 ways. They left before I could even sit down. "We'll visit on Sundays," Gabriel said, already halfway out the door. The sound of their footsteps retreating down the linoleum hallway was the most definitive sound I have ever heard. I stood in the center of that strange room, surrounded by the smell of other people's endings, and realized the truth. They didn't put me here to save me. They didn't put me here because I was sick. They put me here because I was worth more to them as a bank balance than as a mother. I was 73 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, the silence of the utterly room alone was interrupted only by the sound of the heavy door locking from the outside. 2 weeks. That was how long I waited in that sterile silence before they dared to show their faces again. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, carrying cheap flowers and artificial smiles, as if they were visiting a distant acquaintance, instead of the woman who gave them life. Gabriel was wearing a new watch, a gold piece, that glittered under the fluorescent lights of the common room. I knew that watch. I knew its price. It was paid for with the floorboards of my hallway and the soil of my garden. Elena sat across from me, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine, terrified that if she looked too closely, she might see the ghost of the mother she had murdered. "How are you adjusting, Mom?" Gabriel asked, his voice dripping with a feigned concern that made my skin crawl. "We heard from the nurses that you haven't been eating much." I really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son. I saw a thief. I didn't see the boy I taught to ride a bike. I saw a man who had sold his own roots to buy a faster car. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and suffocating, until the smile on his face began to fracture. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. My voice was a cold, steady blade that cut through the polite theater they were trying to perform. "I am adjusting to the smell of betrayal," I said, my voice echoing in the small visiting area. Elena flinched as if I had struck her. "I am adjusting to the realization that I raised 2 people who value paper over blood. Tell me, Gabriel, does the gold on your wrist feel heavy? Does it remind you of the piano you sold? Does it remind you of the bed your father died in, which is probably sitting in a warehouse now because it didn't fit your modern aesthetic? Gabriel's face hardened. He leaned forward, the mask of the dutiful son finally slipping. We did what was necessary, Mom. The house was a drain. You were becoming a burden. We have lives. We have careers we couldn't spend every weekend fixing a leaking roof or worrying if you'd left the gas on. A burden. I whispered, and for a moment, the pain was so sharp I thought my heart would literally stop. I was the roof over your heads for 40 years. I was the gas that kept you warm. I was the bank that never charged interest and the heart that never closed its doors. You didn't sell the house because it was a drain, Gabriel. You sold it because you are empty. You and your sister are so hollow that you need my walls to fill the gaps in your own souls. Elena started to cry then, those soft, performative tears that she used to get what she wanted when she was a child. Mom, you're being unfair. We put the money into a trust for your care. I stood up then. It's all for you. My legs trembling, but my spirit finally upright. I walked over to the table and pushed the cheap flowers onto the floor. Don't you dare lie to me. I saw the bank alerts. I saw the way you divided the spoils like soldiers over a fallen kingdom. You didn't put me here to care for me. You put me here so you wouldn't have to look at the wreckage you've made of this family. You locked me in this room so you could sleep better in houses built on my sacrifice. But listen to me carefully. You can take the money, you can take the land, and you can take every piece of furniture I ever owned. But you will never, ever have my blessing. The room went deathly quiet. Other residents and nurses turned to look, but I didn't care. I looked at Elena, who was shaking, and at Gabriel, whose face was flushed with a mixture of rage and shame. You think you've won because you have the signatures and the keys. I continued, leaning down, so I was inches from Gabriel's face. But you've lost the only thing that was ever truly yours. You've lost a mother. From this day on, when you look in the mirror, you won't see success. You will see two people who traded their mother's life for a commission. Enjoy your money. I hope it keeps you warm at night, because the love you threw away will never come back to find you. I turned my back on them before they could respond. I didn't wait for their excuses or their hollow apologies. I walked back toward my small, lonely room with a dignity I hadn't felt in months. I heard Gabriel shout something about me being ungrateful and senile, but his words couldn't reach me anymore. The confrontation was over. The truth was out in the open, raw and bleeding. They were no longer my children, and I was no longer their protector. As I reached my door and heard the lock click behind me, I realized that I was finally free of the lie. I was a prisoner in a building, but they were prisoners of their own greed, and their sentence would last much longer than mine. The air in the visiting room felt ionized, as if a storm had just broken inside the four walls. Gabriel stood up, smoothing his expensive suit jacket, a gesture so arrogant it made my blood boil. You talk about love, Mom, but love doesn't pay for property taxes. Love doesn't fix a crumbling foundation, he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. You were clinging to that house like a corpse clings to its shroud. We did you a favor. We liquidated a dying asset before it took us down with it. I looked at his hands, those clean, soft hands that had never known a day of hard labor because I had worked until my fingers bled to keep them that way. A dying asset? I repeated, the irony bitter on my tongue. That asset was where you took your first steps. That asset was where your father worked 3 jobs so you could have that Ivy League degree you use to belittle me now. Every brick in that house was laid with a sacrifice you aren't capable of understanding because you've never loved anything more than your own reflection. I turned to Elena, who was frantically wiping her eyes, her jewelry clinking a sound that reminded me of chains. And you, Elena. You used to hide in my bed during thunderstorms. You told me I was the only person who made you feel safe. Now, you're the one making the sky fall on me. Tell me, how much was my safety worth to you? Was it enough for that new apartment in the city? Was it enough for the designer bags you carry to hide the smell of your own guilt? Elena's sobbing stopped abruptly. She looked up, and for the first time, I saw the cold, calculating woman she had become. I'm tired of being the villain in your fairy tale, Mom. You think you were a saint, but you were a weight. Every time we visited, it was a guilt trip. Every time we tried to move forward, you pulled us back into the past. We wanted a clean slate. We wanted the inheritance that was legally ours anyway. Why wait until you're dead to enjoy what we worked for? The room seemed to tilt. The sheer honesty of her greed was more devastating than any lie. They felt entitled to my life. They weren't even pretending anymore. Even done living it. Worked for. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound that startled a nurse nearby. You worked for nothing. You inherited a legacy and traded it for a lifestyle. You are children playing with matches in a house I built. And now that you've burned it down, you think you're free. But look at yourselves. You can't even look me in the eye for more than 5 seconds without your voices shaking. That's I not leaned freedom, closer, ignoring the ache in my joints. That's a haunting. You think this building is my prison? No. This room has 4 walls, but your life has no foundation. You have the money now, but you have no home. And the day will come when you realize that a bank account cannot hold your hand when you're afraid. Gabriel grabbed Elena's arm, ready to leave. We're done here. We'll have the administrator handle your requests from now on. Don't call us Mom. The new word they use. We need to discard the people who know who they truly are. Toxicity. As they walked toward the exit, I saw them exchange a look not of regret, but of relief. They were relieved to be rid of the evidence of their betrayal. I stood my ground, my shadow long and thin on the linoleum floor, watching the 2 people I had loved most in the world walk out of my life, leaving behind nothing but the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of a locked door. I was the one behind bars, but as I watched them go, I realized they were the ones who were truly lost. The first few weeks after the confrontation were a blur of white noise and tasteless meals. When the fire of anger dies down, all that remains is the cold ash of loneliness. I would sit by the window of room 302, watching the cars come, and go in the parking lot, wondering which one of them belonged to a child who actually loved their mother. I learned the rhythm of the facility, the rattling of the medicine cart at 8 o'clock a.m., the hollow sound of the television in the lounge, and the forced cheerfulness of the staff, who looked at me not as Clara, but as a room number that needed to be checked off a list. The silence of my children was a physical weight. They didn't call. They didn't send a card. They had successfully simplified me out of their existence. I spent hours staring at my hands, the same hands that had once held theirs. I looked at the 6 boxes in the corner, still half-packed. I didn't want to unpack them. To unpack was to admit that this was permanent. To hang my few remaining clothes in that tiny closet was to accept that the master bedroom of my home, with its view of the garden and the smell of old books, was gone forever. I was a refugee in my own life. I started to notice the others around me, the ghosts of parents left behind. There was Mrs. Higgins in 305, who dressed in her finest Sunday clothes every morning, waiting for a son who hadn't visited in 3 years. There was Mr. Reese, who shouted for his daughter in his sleep, his cries echoing through the thin walls like a warning I hadn't heeded. We were a collection of broken legacies, a warehouse for the inconvenient. I realized then that my children hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my context. Without my home, without my role as the family anchor, who was I? The news of the sale reached me through a legal notice sent to the facility. The asset had been liquidated. The house was to be demolished to make way for a luxury condominium complex. Gabriel's architecture firm, I noticed with a sting of irony, was listed as the lead designer. He wasn't just selling my past, he was building his future on top of its ruins. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, imagining the wrecking balls swinging through the kitchen where I had made their birthday cakes. I felt every imaginary blow in my own chest. They weren't just erasing a building. They were erasing the evidence that we had ever been happy. The physical toll of the heartbreak began to manifest. My steps became shorter, my appetite vanished, and the world seemed to lose its sharpness. The nurses called it adjustment period, but I knew it was the slow, steady erosion of the will to live. When you realize that the people you would have died for have decided you are better off handled than loved, something inside you breaks that no medicine can fix. I would look at the photos of Gabriel and Eleanor, the ones I kept on my small nightstand, and I didn't feel love anymore. I felt a profound, chilling pity. They were millionaires now, but they were orphans by choice. I began to find a strange, bitter strength in the isolation. If I had no family, then I had no one left to disappoint. I stopped wearing the mask of the good mother. I stopped making excuses for them when the nurses asked if I had any visitors. No, I would say clearly, my voice no longer trembling. My children are dead. They died the day they decided a house was more valuable than a home. It was a cold comfort, but it was honest. I started to reclaim the small space I had left. My mother's pearls, the ones Gabriel hadn't managed to snatch in the top drawer. I was no longer a pillar. I was a survivor of a war. One hadn't known I was fighting. But the nights were the hardest. In the darkness, the memories of the garden and the sound of the wind through the old oak tree would return to haunt me. I could almost smell the lilies. I could almost hear the laughter of the children they used to be. And I would cry not for the money, not for the house, but for the tragedy of two souls who grew up to be so small. I was 73, sitting in a locked room, watching the moon reflect off a paved parking lot, realizing that the greatest sacrifice I ever made wasn't giving them my life, it was giving them the power, or to destroy it. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a place where people go to be forgotten. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a clock ticking in an empty hallway. I began to measure my life, not in years or achievements, but in the small, humiliating milestones of institutional living. The day I stopped wearing my own shoes because my feet were too swollen from the sedentary grief. The day I realized I had forgotten the sound of my own front door locking. My identity was being peeled away, layer by layer, like old wallpaper in a house that no one intended to live in again. I spent an entire afternoon sitting in the common room, watching a fly struggle against the window pane. It wanted the sky, but it was met with cold, unyielding glass. I felt a kinship with that insect. I had spent my life building a glass house of maternal devotion, only to find myself trapped on the wrong side of the pane. A nurse, a young girl with a name tag that said Jessica, came over and patted my hand. Her touch was professional light, antiseptic, devoid of history. "You're very quiet today, Clara. Would you like to join the knitting circle?" I looked at her, and for a second, I wanted to tell her that I used to manage a multi-million-dollar estate. I wanted to tell her that I once hosted dinners for governors and poets. But the words felt too heavy to lift. In this place, I was just Clara, the woman in 302 who didn't get visitors. The most brutal blow came in the form of a social media post that Eleanor had forgotten to block me from seeing. I shouldn't have looked, but the curiosity of a broken heart is a self-destructive thing. There she was, standing in a sleek, glass-walled apartment that looked more like a gallery than a home. She was holding a champagne flute, laughing with people who looked as polished and hollow as she was. The caption read, "New Beginnings." Finally shedding the weight of the past. The weight was me. The past was the decades of love I had poured into her. I sat on my narrow bed and felt a cold, hollow laughter bubble up in my throat. She had traded a mother's soul for a view of the skyline. She looked happy. That was the part that hurt the most, that the betrayal hadn't cost her a single night of sleep. Gabriel was different. He didn't post photos, but he sent a lawyer to deliver a final box of personal effects that hadn't sold at the auction. It was a box of junk to them, but to me, it was the shrapnel of my life. Inside, I found a clay handprint Gabriel had made in kindergarten, with "I love you, Mommy" etched in crooked letters. I found the pressed flowers from my husband's funeral. These were the things they deemed worthless. They kept the silver, the bonds, and the real estate, and sent me the memories, as if to say, "Here, you can keep the sentiment, we'll keep the value." I held that small clay handprint until my own hand cramped. I wondered at what point that little boy's heart had turned into a calculator. At what point did he look at me and stop seeing a person and start seeing a barrier to his next promotion? I began to have dreams about the house not as it was, but as it was becoming. I dreamed of the wrecking ball hitting the nursery walls. I dreamed of the dust of my life settling on the expensive suits of the developers. I realized that my children weren't just taking my money. They were attempting to rewrite our history so that they weren't the villains. If they could convince themselves I was senile or incapable, then they weren't cruel, they were responsible. They were performing an act of mercy by burying me alive. The aftermath wasn't just about losing a home. It was about the realization that the people I loved most required my destruction to feel successful. I was the sacrifice at the altar of their ambition, and the worst part was that I had handed them the knife myself. The winter has arrived, and with it, a strange, biting clarity. From the window of room 302, I can no longer see the construction cranes that dismantled my past. I only see the falling snow, white and silent, covering the world in a blanket of indifference. I am 74 now. A year has passed since I was simplified out of my own life. Gabriel and Elena stopped visiting altogether 6 months ago. Their last legal representative sent a final document, a cold confirmation that all accounts had been settled and my maintenance was guaranteed. They think they've paid their debt. They think that by ensuring I have a bed and 3 meals a day, they have balanced the scales of a lifetime of devotion. I don't hate them anymore. Hate requires an energy I no longer wish to expend on those who are already gone. Instead, I feel a quiet, pervasive sadness, the kind you feel for a beautiful glass that has shattered beyond repair. I spend my days in the library of the facility, reading stories of other lives, other betrayals. I have found a small community of survivors here. We don't talk about our bank accounts or our lost real estate. We talk about the color of the sky and the taste of a good cup of tea. When you have nothing left to lose, you finally learn the true value of the present moment. I am no longer Clara the estate owner or Clara the mother of success. I am just Clara. And in this stripped-down version of myself, I have found a dignity that their gold could never buy. I often think about the new building standing where my garden used to be. I imagine the strangers living in those glass boxes, unaware that the ground beneath them is soaked with 40 years of a mother's prayers. My children think they built a monument to their success, but they only built a tomb for their heritage. They have the money, the cars, and the prestige, but they have lost the ability to feel the warmth of a true home. They are wandering in a desert of their own making, forever thirsty for a love they traded for a commission. I realize now that my greatest legacy wasn't the house or the money. It was the capacity to love so deeply that it hurt. They didn't inherit that. And for that, I pity them most of all. Last night, I took out the small clay handprint Gabriel made all those years ago. I didn't hold it with bitterness. I looked at it as a relic of a person who no longer exists. The boy who made this is gone, replaced by a man I don't recognize. I realize that I don't need to forgive them for my sake. I need to release them so I can finally rest. I placed the handprint on the windowsill, letting the moonlight hit the crooked letters. I am letting go of the guilt I felt for failing to raise them better. I am letting go of the hope that they will one day walk through that door and ask for forgiveness. The door is locked, but for the first time, I am the one who holds the key to my own inner peace. My life is quiet now, and the days are short. But in this small room, surrounded by my 6 boxes and my memories, I am richer than they will ever be. I have my integrity. I have my truth. And I have the memory of a love that was real, even if it wasn't returned in the end. As the sun sets over the parking lot, casting along,